Welcome to today's session. So, today I have something in mind that I'm going to talk about. Generally, I have spontaneous sessions, mm, and that's good too. But sometimes it's also part of this spontaneity is that, okay, something is there in the mind that, you want to talk about. And while I haven't really prepared what I'm going to talk about this particular topic, but uh, it's a continuation from what uh, we spoke about last time, which was about coming home. So I don't know in what sequence I'll be posting these videos, but one of the videos is about coming home and finding a sense of belonging, which means we all are looking for that place that we can call as home, a place where we can stay, where we feel like a location or a home, where we house that we feel we belong to, a community that we feel we belong to, um, a purpose, some kind of a work that we feel belong to. And when we have these three factors, then we feel a sense of coming home. And until we don't find that fit in terms of purpose, place, community, people, we kind of seeking, where is home for us? So home is just one word which signifies it's like if I were to give an example, then imagine that somebody's a circle. We all have different shapes, like a circle, like somebody's a triangle, somebody's a square, somebody's a rectangle. Somebody's like there's no particular shape, like a defined shape with edges. Interestingly, if you notice, nothing in nature has like sharp edges. It's only something which is mostly man-made has those sharp edges. Nature has very unique shapes. Nothing is repeated. So given our different shapes, when we find that home, we feel that sense like we fit in. It's like we fit into that slot, and when we fit into that slot, it feels like this feels comfortable. Otherwise, we are trying hard to fit in, or we are feeling that something is not quite right. It's almost like you're not wearing your own clothes. You're wearing something which is not your own. It's either tight fitting, whether either it's too loose, or either the colors don't match for you, or the fabric. I'm just giving different examples, shapes, clothes. So it's about fitting and finding. But quite often, and this is what today's session is about, we some for most of us, it's a journey of finding home. It is not like immediately, um, if you're very fortunate, perhaps if you have had um, very liberal and enlightened parenting, then perhaps you've had the freedom to explore your natural essence even as a child, and you didn't have to fit in. But most of us start off our life journey through conditioning and conformity. So we constantly are adjusting our natural self to fit into the requirements of society. Now, that could be the requirements of a family situation, the requirements of a school, requirements of a social setup, a community, religious. So we are always told that, you need to do this, you need to behave like this, you need to study this, you need to, and then there's an element of comparison. So our naturalness gets lost. So for most of us, it's a journey. We have to undertake a journey to find that home, whether it's place, purpose, people. And it's a gradual process. And when we don't fit in, it's not like, when you undertake a journey to find home, like for me, there was a whole journey that was from being a chartered accountant, qualifying as a chartered accountant, to now teaching spirituality. It's quite a journey. Or a journey from maybe staying in a place like a city in Bombay and then staying in closer to the hills, Dharamshala. Now that's a journey. So, so it's a journey. It's an unfoldment, and it takes time. For most people, it takes time. And when you are, because you can't change your situation, you can't immediately. So it's not about finding, not only finding the right opportunities outside, but also about inner transformation for you to fit into those opportunities. It's a both way process, that the external environment has to also be conducive, and you have to be ready for that external environment. And then that fitting in happens. So it's a gradual process. So what inevitably happens is, when we are in a situation which is not always to our liking, uh, whether it is a place that we are in, it could be a family situation where it's not conducive for us. I got a call from somebody yesterday. She's going through a difficult time because of um, the stress in the family. She's feeling isolated. She's not feeling understood. Those kind of things. And we all different people go through that at different times. Or it could be being in a job which is not satisfying, and yet you're doing it because of financial reasons, or also you're doing it because you don't know what else to do. That's another aspect to it. The other could be in terms of a place. That's another thing. This is something that, being in a place where you don't like. Maybe you're staying in a city. You don't like staying in a city, but you don't know where else to go. You don't have anything in mind. You know that this doesn't give me joy, staying in a city, the hustle bustle, the noise, the pollution. But I don't know where else. Or maybe you don't have the resources, or it's not easy for you to change immediately your situation. Or it could be being part of a community where you have maybe outgrown those friends or community, and then you feel a sense of isolation and aloneness being in that kind of a community. Or it could be related to even health. You are wanting to do something, but your health doesn't seem to allow you to do that. And sometimes unexpected illnesses or, health situations occur which were never expected. Maybe uh, it could be about finances, that again, you want to do something, but your financial situation doesn't allow that. Or you want to be in a certain space, but your financial situation doesn't allow that, and you're dependent on somebody. It could be about being in a relationship for a very long time, and even though it doesn't feel like home being in that relationship, whether it's a partner relationship or a spouse relationship, or any kind of a family situation, but it's very scary to want to move out of it, because it's like facing the unknown. At least you are in a known setup, an emotional setup, where at least it's like a known devil is better than an unknown devil. So you don't want to take the risk of getting into uncharted waters and unknown. So all these situations where we feel that this the space that I am in currently doesn't make me feel like I'm home, yet for some reason I am not able to go towards something that makes me feel home. Maybe I don't have the resources to go towards that. Maybe I don't have enough self-awareness that what is it that will give me a sense of home, or it is the fear of stepping into the unknown. It could be various factors. But what all these situations make us feel essentially is that one thing, and which is what I would be talking about today. And that is, all these situations make us feel vulnerable. And vulnerability is a state of feeling helpless, feeling you want something, or feeling you don't even know what you want, or feeling you don't have the ability to get what you want. And as human beings, we all experience vulnerability. I don't think there's any human being who has not experienced vulnerability in their life. Mm. Um, a state of helplessness, a state of confusion, lack of clarity, a state of inability to take action, fear, anxiety, different ways we feel vulnerable. Now, how is it that we deal with vulnerability, and what can we do to use that vulnerability to come closer to our true self? Because these sessions are really not self-help sessions, so to speak. These sessions are more about self-inquiry, coming closer to our true self, or realizing who we are not. So this is the essence of these sessions, the philosophy of Advaita, non-duality. So these are not really self-help sessions, but we all experience problems at a mental, physiological level, emotional level of vulnerability, of impulsive habits, addictions. So, how can we deal with these situations and come closer to our true self? And that's what this discussion or this will be about. So, it will not be about just vulnerability, but how we can use vulnerability to come closer to our true self, how it can be used as a medium for I'm not going to use the word self growth. I'm not going to use the word personal growth, because this is not about self growth. This is not about personal growth. It is to realize who I am not, and it is to realize who I truly am. So this is not a sequential journey of growth, becoming a better version of me, and all of that. And I've already spoken about some of that in my previous sessions. I think if somebody's interested in that, then there's one session called Practicing Non-Doing, and that's where I've spoken about that this is not about growth and becoming a better person. So coming back to vulnerability, so what generally is the knee jerk, or the thing most people tend to do when they start feeling vulnerable? And I'm just talking most people, most normal human beings, when vulnerability hits us, that state of helplessness hits us, we um, we try to find some way to make meaning of what's happening. We try to find some way to um, seek validation for what's happening. These are two things that happens. Like, what's happening is trying to make sense of what's happening when we are vulnerable. Trying to find validation means what's happening and what I'm feeling is valid. And so that's the other thing that happens. And the third thing that happens is we try to make an effort to get out of being vulnerable, because the mind doesn't like to be vulnerable. The mind likes to be in a state of empowerment. The mind likes to be in a state of control. The mind likes to be in a state of being in charge. So um, so these are the three general things: making sense of what's happening. Second is seeking validation for what's happening. And third is trying to free yourself from vulnerability. These are the ways that the mind operates and tries to. So when so let's look at each one separately. The first is trying to make meaning of vulnerability. Essentially, when we look at trying to make meaning of vulnerability, we are always finding some cause or some reason of why we are feeling vulnerable. And often enough we find someone responsible for our vulnerability, which, if I were to use simple words, often there is a blame associated. Someone is responsible for my vulnerability. Maybe, okay, one of the things that I forgot about vulnerability, which is heartbreak. And that, uh, how could I forget that? Heartbreak makes us vulnerable. You're in a relationship and suddenly that relationship breaks up, whether it's a marriage or whether it's a romantic relationship. Now that is a deep source of vulnerability. And so quite often when we experience vulnerability, we often have someone to assign that this person is responsible for my vulnerability. And if I were to use a simple word, we often blame someone for our vulnerability. Like, I'm feeling vulnerable because of, um, something, because someone is behaving like this, someone is not understanding me. Sometimes, um, there may not even be someone. There could be like a financial crisis. Maybe there could be a health crisis, so you can't really pin the blame. But the mind tries to then find someone, God or destiny or something. It sort of projects that onto that. It may call that God, it may call it uh, destiny, and it says, like, because of that I'm feeling what I'm feeling. So that's the first thing that often the mind does. It tries to assign responsibility for that vulnerability on someone. The second thing that the mind tries to do is it tries to mm, seek solace, which means the mind will look for someone to tell its story of vulnerability. Look, this happened to me. Oh, this is what I'm going through. Oh, this person did this. And often enough, of course, you'll find someone. You'll either find your friends, or you may find, generally the mind is looking for somebody you look up to, an authority figure, a mentor, a coach, a counselor, if not anything else, a guru who will mm, who will validate your story of vulnerability, that yes, you're feeling this and you're valid to feel this. And um, maybe the person will give you some sympathy, that person will give you um, mm, some guidance, some words of advice, and then the mind feels a little better, that someone I look up to has heard my story, has validated my story, and then has given me some words of wisdom. And then that's the other thing that the mind does to deal with vulnerability. The third thing that the mind does to deal with vulnerability is try to free itself from vulnerability. It will try different things, different ways to not be vulnerable. And because it's not able to accept its vulnerability, it feels very, very uncomfortable. It feels very conflicted. Sometimes the mind gets into a state of depression. So then it tries ways and means. Now, those ways and means are healing methodologies or self-help tools and techniques and um, a variety of things. And that's what and some of them also work the way the mind does, making meaning. Second is finding solace, validation for the vulnerability. And the third is trying to free yourself from the vulnerability. You're trying to control life and how you're feeling. And these are not dysfunctional. I wouldn't say that. mm, these have their own relevance and usefulness at a certain level. I'm not saying that these are dysfunctional ways. I'm not saying that these are not relevant. They are useful and relevant at a certain level. So what this conversation is about is exploring the next level of how we can use vulnerability for if I have to use a word which I really don't like, spiritual growth. Okay, a better word would be for realizing our true self. A better word would be for disidentifying from the mind. I think that's the most practical way to say it, to disidentify, because our vulnerability is identification with the mind and its story. So, how we can use vulnerability to cultivate greater awareness and to realize I am not the mind and its story, but I am awareness. I think that's the best. So, this is what this conversation is about. So, making meaning of vulnerability, finding validation for your vulnerability, and trying to do something about your vulnerability has its own relevance and uses as a certain point of at a certain level. And sometimes the vulnerability is so strong that that is really what is needed perhaps at that time. But the counter to that is, and now I'm coming to the next aspect, is often when we look at um, vulnerability, the cause of the vulnerability is I am a person, I want something, I'm unable to get it. I am a person who's undergoing a very difficult situation. I am a person who is unable to be in an environment that is supportive to me. Now, these are generally the reasons for vulnerability, whatever may be the vulnerability, financial, health, relationship wise, or work wise. Basically, this is the story. I'm a person who is undergoing a difficult experience, whatever it is. So that's the cause of the vulnerability. Now, if you really look at that, if we want to realize that I am not a person who's undergoing an experience, because the wisdom of oneness is to realize I am not this person who is undergoing this experience, because that's a story of the mind, a very compelling story, especially when you're extremely, extremely vulnerable. So, if I feed this story more and more, then this identity is only going to get stronger. So, at some level, if the vulnerability is very intense, yes, go and talk about your vulnerability to somebody, share your story with somebody, get it out of your system. Uh, but don't overdo it. What I'm trying to say is, some people create a identity and story out of their vulnerability, and then it becomes counterproductive. Like, I've had people even in my relations and family who just keep going, and I've experienced this in my childhood also with uh, somebody. I'm not going to name that person. This person is going to each person and sharing his or her tragic story, the same story of being abandoned by somebody significant in their life. And you meet somebody, the same story gets repeated. You meet the second person, the same story gets repeated. You meet the third person, the same story gets repeated. And everywhere, this person is collecting sympathy stamps. I mean, I'm using transactional analysis language. And how many times are you going to repeat the same story, and how many times are you going to get sympathy? So what happens is, when you overdo this meaning making, finding reason of why something is happening, or finding validation for your story, or trying to do something, actually you're not really doing anything, you're just repeating the identity and the story. You're strengthening this identity as a victim, as this poor me, as this vulnerable me. And I think one needs to use, see, friends will of course give you the hearing once, and if you keep repeating the story, then maybe you will lose out on good friends, because who wants to hear a sob story all the time? Perhaps you can go to a counselor. If the person is a good counselor, he would probably listen to your story once, maybe listen to it twice, and then try to move you beyond the story and to move you to a state of questioning your own unconscious beliefs and what's contributing to all of this. So otherwise, you can keep repeating the same story to the counselor, and the counselor will also, if he's getting paid, then he'll keep listening to your story, because I think the counseling is the most subjective profession in the world. Mm. So, and also getting an effective counselor is really a blessing. So the idea of counseling is not just somebody constantly listening to your Ram Kahani and your stories and stories. I mean, that gives you maybe one session, maybe two sessions will be an element, but there has to be an element of moving beyond the story. So that is where it is counterproductive. When you use your vulnerability to create an identity out of your suffering and a story, and then the mind gets into blaming, complaining, criticizing, feeling sorry for yourself, uh, wanting to seek validation and solace from others, then that this is how then the identity and the story gets perpetuated. On the other hand, rather than, if one has reached a certain level of maturity, one has reached a certain level of awareness, this is what I would really recommend. If it's possible to just be vulnerable. I don't know how many people can really do that. No need to find, if it's possible, no need to make meaning of the vulnerability, like find reasons and cause of why this is happening. If it's possible not to find validation and solace for your story from somebody else, be it a friend, be it a sympathizer, be it a counselor, be it a therapist. And if it's possible to not try to free yourself from the vulnerability. Not that I'm saying that you need to delve in it, but you're not trying to get rid of it either. Then what happens? That there is a feeling of vulnerability, and eventually, what is vulnerability at the most fundamental level, at the most basic level? What is vulnerability? Vulnerability is without the story of the mind, cause and effect, and all of that. Vulnerability is nothing but sensations in the body. Like I'm feeling like, yeah, there is an element of why I'm feeling vulnerable. Maybe I'm feeling the reason for vulnerability is health conditions, financial conditions, a relationship issue. Maybe I don't know where I belong. Maybe the work I'm doing doesn't suit me. There could be various reasons, or maybe a death of a loved one, something. There's just a feeling and a sensation in the body which is getting triggered by all of this. Just focus on that. So vulnerability could be a feeling of mm, a lump in the throat. Vulnerability could be feeling tearful. Vulnerability could be a feeling of sadness. Now I'm using sadness, but it's a more a feeling of at a physiological body level. So be with the sensations of vulnerability without trying to run away from it, without trying to necessarily tell your story of vulnerability to somebody. Like I said, if it's possible, if you have that level of awareness and maturity, if it's possible. Otherwise, if it's too intense, maybe you talk about it to somebody, but don't constantly repeat the story. Otherwise, you just are strengthening the identity of being a vulnerable person and what's happening to you. So just be with it and don't try to necessarily do anything about it. It's like, yes, there is this utter helplessness. This is this feeling of utter I don't know what life wants. I don't know what the future has in store. I don't know whether how long this feeling will last. I don't know. And totally accepting this thing called I don't know. Because what the mind is trying to do is know. It wants to know when this feeling will go. It wants to know what will happen next. It wants to know uh, who's responsible for how I'm feeling. So basically, the mind wants to know. And vulnerability is a feeling I don't know. And I'm not saying that you are okay with not knowing, but you are in a state of just being with that feeling I don't know. Another word for I don't know is vulnerability. Like if I were to share like a personal example of my vulnerability, uh, it's like, and there have been so many times in my life I've been vulnerable. I can't, I could write a book on my vulnerabilities, from choosing to be a chartered accountant and then feeling so vulnerable, not enjoying what I was doing and not knowing what I want to do. I remember once I was sitting on the couch, and this is long, long years, and every cell in my body was wanting authentic self-expression, and I knew that being an accountant was not my expression, but I didn't know how or what that was like. It was so vivid, that feeling. Okay. But over a period of time, I have realized that, or no, I've more than realized, I have learned to accept or embrace vulnerability without having to make meaning out of it, without having to find validation and solace from somebody about it, without having to trying to get rid of it. So one example I'll give you from my own personal life of vulnerability was, like I've been staying in Bombay now for almost ever, other than my childhood, which was in a boarding school in Missouri. And Bombay is not really necessarily the space for me. So being in Bombay was not something that was conducive for me. It wasn't nurturing for me. It didn't feel, the space didn't feel right. And yet I didn't know for the longest time now, where am I supposed to go? Where am I supposed to be? I mean, I just, nothing really. So when I left Bombay in May, uh, I left with the intention that, I need to find home. I don't know where home is. I need to find a space where I feel a sense of, where I feel at home, where I feel a sense of this space nurtures me, gives me life. So I went to Haridwar because there was a possibility of working with somebody who was setting up a mindfulness institute. And when I went there, then those people didn't really respond and nothing really happened. And also, I thought, I would be staying in Haridwar like for a month or two, because I thought, I've been wanting, I thought Rishikesh is where I want to go, but I find Rishikesh has now changed too much, right? A lot of commercialization. So I thought, okay, let me stay in Haridwar. And when I went in Haridwar in May, it was extremely hot, extremely crowded. And in fact, I fell ill for some time. And also the people I was supposed to be collaborating with for this mindfulness institute, it didn't really seem to take off. And I remember feeling very, very vulnerable. I remember, one morning, after like spending a few days in Haridwar, going to the Ganges for a dip and feeling very, very vulnerable. Like, I don't know where. I belong. Feeling sort of teary, feeling a sense of sadness in my throat. I can sense my vulnerability, and I don't have any other story around it. I have nothing like, oh, God is responsible for this, giving me through a hard time. Why have I got to go through this? Or even having to, call up somebody and talk about my vulnerability. Look, this is happening. Nothing. I'm vulnerable. I don't know where I'm meant to be. I don't know what the future has in store. I just surrender. And I remember when I took that dip in the Ganges, it was like a feeling of complete surrender. I was feeling the vulnerability, I was feeling the sensations of vulnerability, but it was a state of complete surrender. Like, I don't know. And that's where it ends. I don't know. I'm not trying to know. I'm not trying to fix. I'm not trying to make meaning out of it. I'm not trying to find a solace for it. I'm not trying to find a solution for it. I'm not trying to find validation for it. I'm not trying to find sympathy for it, which is what all the mind does. So when you embrace your vulnerability, when you surrender to your vulnerability, what you're actually doing is you're offering your vulnerability to silence. You're offering your vulnerability to the unknown. You're offering your vulnerability to existence. You're offering your vulnerability to God. You're offering your vulnerability to divine. You're offering your vulnerability to mystery. You're offering your vulnerability to the universe. I'm using different words. So you don't, and I'm just, this is my interpretation for it. I think the biggest, the most potent and the most powerful prayer that one can have, whether to God, to the divine, to existence, is a power, is the experience of being completely vulnerable. And just being in that vulnerability, not trying to do anything about it. Just, yeah, I am vulnerable. It's like, if you feel like crying, then cry. If you feel, but you offer that vulnerability to silence. You don't offer that vulnerability to some counselor, a coach, a mentor, a guide, a friend. Fine, if you have to talk about it, you talk about it. But don't make a story about your vulnerability and create suffering out of it. Because that's what the mind does. It takes vulnerability and creates an identity and a story out of it, and it keeps talking about it. And I think that, to me, is like really offering your vulnerability to the unknown. Now, I don't know how the unknown works, when it works, but it works. I mean, that's what I have seen in my life, because life is never same. It is constantly moving and changing. And then a friend of mine was here in Dharamshala in Dharamkot. She said, "Why don't you come here? It's nice and pleasant." And then here I came, and I've now been here like for about 5 months. And then I moved a couple of homestays, and I finally found a space where I feel a sense of home, a sense of belonging, a sense of like, this is where I want to stay. And I'm not even saying, I'm not trying to give you hope through this story. So please don't think that, oh, now if I surrender my vulnerability, then the universe will do something. And because the mind wants to create a story and an idea out of it. Oh, if I do this, then this. I'm not saying any of this. And all I'm sharing is an experience from my life where I was extremely vulnerable. I didn't do anything about it. Life unfolded, put me in a place where I feel that the universe has responded to my vulnerability. I don't know what the next day will bring. I don't know the next moment will bring. So there is always a living with vulnerability. It is never like, oh, now I am set for life. There's so in many ways, if we can live with this feeling, I don't know, because life is inherently vulnerable. Life is inherently uncertain. Life is inherently unpredictable. In terms of life situations, you don't know how life is going to change tomorrow. Relationships could change, health could change, financial conditions could change, something or the other could always change. But if you can cultivate this attitude, I embrace vulnerability. I I totally can embrace the fact that I am in a state of not knowing, because I really don't know how life unfolds. The only thing then what I know is that there is something within me which is not of the mind, which is not of the thinking mind, which is chattering all the time, which is making stories all the time, which is creating all reasoning all the time, which is doing creating all the identities. That there is something in me which is beyond the chattering mind, and this something in me mm, uh, is a living presence. If I can close my eyes for some time, if I can be free of my chattering mind for some time, I come into this state which is just living presence, which is just consciousness, which is just existence. This thing doesn't need knowing. This thing is a fundamental aspect of who I am, which is not even I am. This is a fundamental aspect of existence, that there is existence here, that there is existence. No matter whatever be the story of my mind, but the fact that there is consciousness, there is presence, there is life, there is existence, this never changes. I don't need to know it. It is self evident. But I can experience consciousness, existence, life, being, presence only when my mind stops chattering. Because otherwise, my mind is constantly chattering, creating stories. So rather than use your vulnerability to create stories out of vulnerability. Oh, this is what's happening to me. Oh, this person did this to me. Oh, God is so unkind. Oh, this is happening because of this. Oh, my suffering is because of this. And then using that story to create another identity by talking about that story to someone and then seeking that validation and trying to feel good about it and then repeating that story often enough. Offer this vulnerability to the divine, if I have to use words like that. I think the best word, offer this vulnerability to silence. I know that there is vulnerability. I don't know what I can do. Not that you don't do anything, you do whatever you can do as the next natural step, because you can only take the next natural step. You can't preempt 10 steps down the line what is going to happen. So you can only take the next natural step to see what you can do about it. But essentially, own up to that vulnerability. Vulnerability is a sign that the mind is feeling helpless, that the mind is feeling it is no longer in control. And in a way, that's a good sign because that is what we need to free ourselves from, this mind and this ego identity. So embrace that vulnerability. And if I may say, that vulnerability has great power in it. That's a great opportunity um, to weaken the mind, the storytelling mind, the controlling mind, the meaning making mind. And that's a great opportunity to shed the mind and the ego and come towards greater silence. It requires a certain degree of maturity, a certain degree of self-awareness to be able to do that. Um, so I will probably say this in three aspects. the unhealthy, the somewhat healthy, the middle path, and the best path. You can, so if at least if you can't do the best path, at least don't do the counterproductive. What is counterproductive is making an identity out of being a victim and telling your story to everybody of how what life is not fair to you or someone is not fair to you. That is really counterproductive. And I've known people who often do that. They get that sense of meaning and identity by talking about their story. The middle ground, I can understand sometimes the vulnerability is very intense. You need to talk about it to someone. You need some degree of validation. So, yes, talk about it once. At most, maybe talk about it twice to somebody, but don't make a habit out of it. And the best, if you have that level of self awareness, you don't even need to talk about it. Just experience that vulnerability with a state of complete surrender and silence. So, and I think that is an extremely powerful way of engaging with vulnerability. It's like vulnerability is meeting silence. And that's really, really powerful. So, so that is how we can use vulnerability to come towards greater awareness, and we can use every opportunity for awareness. So vulnerability is a great opportunity for awareness. We feel that, oh, I can only be like be myself or aware only when I have certain conditions which are conducive for me. Yes, absolutely right, that there are certain conditions conducive for your growth. So you need that space. But if you don't have that immediately, then you use vulnerability, because the eventual goal is not really to be in a certain space, a place with a certain set of people or doing something. Pretty much it's a matter of how life unfolds. Yes, you do whatever you can, but it's pretty much where life takes us. But the real, if you have come to this wisdom and this knowledge, the real purpose, if I were to say, of this knowledge is self-realization, to weaken our identification with the mind and to come into a state of oneness and awareness and silence and presence. So use vulnerability to come into oneness and awareness and silence and presence. Don't wait for your conditions to change. Then you will say that, no, I will come to oneness and silence and presence. Wherever you are, you use those conditions to come to oneness and presence and silence. So that's, I would say, how vulnerability can be a very powerful um, medium to come to oneness, presence, and silence. So let's end the session with a small sitting practice. And the reason the sitting practice is very important is because then it just helps us to be aware of what is happening. If we don't do the sitting practice, if we don't practice awareness, then the vulnerability comes with its intensity and sweeps us off its feet with its meaning making, storytelling, identification, validation, solace, sympathy, all of that. Then the vulnerability does. But if you have awareness, then you can just watch and be vulnerable. That's fine. I mean, like, there's a term in transactional analysis. There are four states. Uh, it's I'm not okay, you're okay, mm, you're you're okay, I'm not okay, no, I'm not okay, you're not okay, I'm okay, you're okay. Now there's a fifth state which I have conceived, and it's like, yes, I am not okay, but that's okay. That is the state of being vulnerable. Like, fine, I'm not okay, but that's okay. Like, I'm not fine, but it's fine. And that is great maturity. That's great emotional strength. Okay, so let's practice, do some sitting practice, and then we'll end this session. So sit comfortably, close your eyes, take a deep breath in and exhale. Bring your attention to whatever is happening right now. Generally, when we say bring your attention to whatever is happening right now, the attention naturally moves to the body, what the body is experiencing right now. Whatever the sensation, at the end of the day, it's just a sensation. A sensation can never kill us. It's only the interpretation of our mind which says there is no hope for the future that creates depression. So just be with whatever the body is sensing, feeling, breathing. Observe the body in silence. The silence is an extraordinary tool for transformation. Whenever we notice whatever is happening in silence, the silence touches it and brings about some change and some shift, which can never come through words. If there's vulnerability, then experience that vulnerability in silence. Silence means no story, no meaning making, no identification, no seeking validation, no seeking some future outcome, nothing, just silence. And if it's not possible to be silent because of the chattering mind, that's fine. Don't fight the mind, don't create self judgments. Whenever the attention moves naturally into silence, reside in silence. That's the practice. The more we develop a taste for silence, not the silence which comes when we are not talking, but also mental silence, the more we realize the beauty of silence. We don't have to constantly think something to live our life. Life can happen very beautifully in silence. It is possible to live life not as a person, but as silence. The person is a figment of our mind. Silence is the fact of existence. It is the backdrop against which everything happens. Embrace uncertainty. Embrace not knowing what the future has in store. Embrace the present moment. Embrace vulnerability with an attitude of surrender to what is. Surrender to the silence. Simply because it's an undeniable fact of who we are. Everything about our existence is temporary and passing. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions. But this silence is ever present and lasting. Remember, even after we come out of the sitting practice, we can access this silence whenever we wish by simply taking a pause, simply shifting our attention into the mode of being a witness and simply surrendering to what is. Take a deep breath in and exhale. Take another deep breath in and exhale. Slowly and gently, rub your palms and cup your eyes. So it's important to have a regular practice of self-awareness, whether you do it by having a allotted time for sitting and meditating. I don't like the word meditating. I think being silent, I think that's a better word because meditation has so many connotations. And try to practice silence whenever you can. Like, just if you're having a cup of tea, do it in silent presence. If you're having a bath, do it in silent presence. It's only a question of constantly remembering. And the more I keep repeating, the more you expose yourself to these teachings, the remembrance will happen faster. So, with that, we end this session, which I would probably title The Power of Vulnerability. And see, the next time you feel vulnerable, if you can put some of this wisdom into practice and see how does that make you feel and what happens. If you want to share, you can share whatever you wish on the comments. So let's end with a small prayer. If you wish, you can close your eyes, join your palms, and namaste. My dear higher self, help me to use vulnerability as an opportunity to realize or come closer to my true self, which is silence. Help me not to use vulnerability as a excuse to create identity, story, meaning making, finding, seeking sympathy, because that only strengthens the mind and the identity. Help me to cultivate an attitude of surrender, an attitude of being comfortable with not knowing, an attitude of just simply being in the moment. I seek your guidance and grace to realize silence, which is my true self. Om Shanti Shanti. Okay, so with that, we end today's session. I'll see you all in the next session. Goodbye. God bless. Take care.